what does the current child welfare system neglect to understand about Native children and families?
Well, so the child welfare system neglects to understand the generational trauma that Indigenous people have faced and continue to face now. With the connection to the Native American boarding schools, to missing murdered Indigenous women, and to the current ongoing genocide that people are going through on the reservations due to the lack of clean water resources and recently like the COVID-19 pandemic. This history of colonial spaces have and still continue to contribute to youth losing their language, their traditions, and their overall culture, much like I'd lost mine myself.
Says before 1978, approximately 80% of Native American families living on reservations lost at least one child to the foster care system, according to data compiled by the National Indian Child Welfare Association. Additionally, more than 25% of all Native children were removed from the families, with 85% receiving placements outside of their tribes or relatives. If there were families and fit family members available, these children were still adopted out to white families. The policies continue to negatively impact individuals, families, and tribes by placing them into the custody of white members when tribal members are available. Non-tribal placement and adoption has created identity issues and disconnected feelings, along with negative mental health outcomes.
I wanted to bring up this piece about like really historical injustices that might go unseen by the system, and more specifically, sort of going back into history and looking at the boarding school era, which in my opinion, and I think it's the consensus of a lot of people, that set in a really dangerous precedent of the removal of Indian children from homes, from our communities, and really viewed them as disposable, as less than. And I think it's important to understand that the removal of Indian children from our homes and our communities did not end with the boarding school era, and is very much so perpetuated by the current state of child welfare in this country.
We're talking about setting the precedence of being disposable, right? We get that message as Indigenous folk like all the time. It's not just child welfare, but it's it's in media, it's in politics, it's in lack of representation across the board, all of these things. So yeah, that language just stuck with me, like disposable, and we see that, and like Wyatt said, it's not just something that was in our history, it's current. I think one thing that came up in our conversation as well was ICWA, and I feel like that is something that we should just briefly touch on, especially because I think we're all aware that there are some current attacks to that law or that type of law. So I just wanted to open up to each of you. Why do you feel like laws like that are really important to keep intact?
Okay, so in short, basically, it was the federal law that governs the removal of out-of-home placement of American Indian children who are within a state's custody. And this law works to protect Native American children while preserving the culture and stability of Native American tribes. The ICWA works to preserve Native American culture by prioritizing keeping Native American children with their relatives or other tribal community members, as well as other Native American families. So ICWA helps search for suitable, sometimes traditional, Native foster parents, and helps pair that, because most of the time there are malintentions with other parents who are considering adopting Native children, and that has to do with like tokenizing Indigenous children.
Yeah, just bouncing off what Wyatt and Christina said, it's definitely important for us to keep ICWA together, and like how she said, tokenizing Indigenous children, because if we're going to talk about that, we're going to talk about white saviorism and how that has played a big role in the ICWA Act, and also just Indigenous youth going into like these white families, is that we have a lot of white people that just assume like, oh, we can just like protect this kid or like keep them out of like, just like, it's mainly like Christians like that are just trying to like keep these kids, and it's like you're not actually doing anything for these kids, you're putting them more in harm by having them have their culture, their identity, and experience like a race, in which is another form of genocide. It's cultural genocide. And I remember, Veronica, if you can like bounce off this, when she showed me this podcast that was called This Land by Rebecca, I don't know.
Nagel, I think is how you say it. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was
Yeah.
going over the importance of the ICWA Act and the removal. And Veronica, if you could lead off with that.
Yeah. And I believe Wyatt, you've heard this podcast as well, so feel free to hop in. I think really what that conversation was talking about was how vital, like how vital children are to Indigenous communities and the future of Indigenous communities. And if we remove children in mass numbers, like we have and continue to do so, then it also impacts like Indigenous communities, like infrastructure, right? Like our land, our water, political power, all of this, because at some point you take enough children away, like what's left of a already like vulnerable small population. So that conversation was talking about like the intersectionality of all of it, and attacking families, attacking children. It is a really it's like modern day assimilation and cultural genocide, to be blunt about it. And it's something that is so ignored in current modern day, right? It's like, oh, ICWA, like, you know, why is that even important? But you let go of that one thing and a whole domino effect happens. Because again, there's just like there's such an importance in children and the hope for that future. So at least that's what I got from that conversation. If anyone has any other thoughts, feel free to add them.
Yeah, another thing that struck me, just listening to that podcast was when she talked about how ICWA is really under siege by this wave of, conservative attacks, on our indigeneity. One thing in particular that I found sort of gut-wrenching and also just like made me really mad was that, the law firm that is, bringing this case to the Supreme Court is a multinational law firm, that breaks in millions of dollars. And so the question becomes like, why, is this law firm that, works with oil and gas and, multinational conglomerates, why are they, pouring so much money into ICWA? And it's because they realize, what the opportunities for exploitation and capitalism can provide them, when they slowly start to take away, Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Yeah, and so that's where I ended, I guess.
Exactly, like separating the Indigenous families and the communities for land and for their own greed is what I really got out of that.
Personally, I think ICWA should stay in place, and I hope they don't overturn it this summer, because this helps include the sovereign nations, and like Wyatt said, helps make sure that they're not taking away the sovereignty of tribal nations. Not where I was going with this, but it was really good.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing up that podcast. I think for anyone who is curious about this current attack on ICWA and some background into it, I think that podcast, This Land, by Rebecca Nagel, is really, it gives a really, a really expansive explanation of what's currently happening and why it's important that ICWA stays in place, which I feel like we all see that as Native people, but I feel like other people who are not Indigenous and are hoping to be allies to this community really do take the time to look into that, because it is a huge thing. One thing I'll say for the state of New Mexico, where I currently live, is we've established Indian child welfare courts. We established one here, and I didn't know this until recently, but we were the 5th ICWA court in the country, which is wild because we have so many indigenous tribes, but we only have 5 courts that specifically target this population. And one thing that I've learned from working with that group of people is that by having indigenous representation in the judges and the caseworkers, in the attorneys for the parents, in the person answering the phone, all of these things, is that these families don't come back into that courthouse again, right? They're given the supports, the culturally relevant and specific supports that they need in order not to return to the system. So I think that that's huge. And the other big thing with that court is the last time I checked in was that there's not been a termination of parental rights. And so I think that that is huge as well, is with representation means families get to stay intact. And so I think my hope is that, we see a wave of things like that that are culturally specific and relevant for our families. Why is Indigenous representation necessary in the child welfare system?
I can go ahead and hop in first. Just firstly, like Native representation, no matter what, just like bottom line, matters, and our voices matter, specifically as Native youth, not just the 4 of us here today on this panel, but Native youth in so many of these conversations and movements for change. It's needed, as Veronica brought up, these systems often lack a level of nuance. They lack trauma-informed care, and they lack cultural-informed care that is super vital to providing protection for these children. Yeah, and I think, it's important because we know what these systems do when we're not involved, when we're not constantly pushing, the envelope, constantly, just being involved. So yeah, representation, it matters for sure.
Yeah, I would say Native American representation is necessary because Indigenous people, we have the knowledge of the experience, the culture, the language, and the tradition. And Indigenous youth that are being put in these foster homes, they need people who are going to understand that and that are going to be able to speak to that experience as another Indigenous person. And again, it's important for representation because, and I hope you guys can understand this, but representation is culture. And without the culture, you lose your identity. And when you lose your identity, it feels like you become lost. And for me personally, that's how it felt when I was in the foster care system, losing my culture and just not having any representation of what it was to be a brown Indigenous Chicana woman, and not having any of that. It felt like I lost my identity and I lost everything with that.
How does a lack of cultural awareness and trauma-informed care contribute to the overrepresentation of BIPOC youth being dually system involved? And how has this impacted your own experience?
I can start with that, and just, to pick back up where Victor left off, I think, one thing that is not emphasized enough in both systems is mental health resources and attention on mental health. And I think when you have 2 systems that criminalize mental health issues, then it's very easy to see that trauma that exists as a child in the system that's not treated is going to lead to the same trauma that criminalizes somebody later on. And I'm not going to get into it, but my own family, I have brothers that, went through the system, were adopted as teenagers and ended up back in the system later on. So, I've seen that firsthand, just how the lack of mental health resources that are available for, my Black brother and my Indigenous brother that did not receive those resources, ending up in the foster or back in the prison system after experiencing it as a teenager. So there's that component of recidivism. I definitely think, I strongly believe that it's just BIPOC youth do not have as much access to mental health resources, and I think that's a huge issue. It's so hard to talk about so many of these issues, microaggressions and trauma that we've experienced, because there's just not as much research on it, to be honest. Like, there's not as much of a sample size in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And, I think that when we talk about mental health, we need to talk about the overuse of prescription medication within these systems, and how just thinking that we could just put youth on these medications and the negative side effects and impacts those medications have on our youth can take a toll as well. Because for me, like, speaking from my experience, that's what they did when I was in the system, when I went into treatment, and I worked really hard to work my way through my trauma, through my healing process, to get off of those medications, because I knew when I aged out of the system, it was gonna be me, myself, and I. And I knew when I was aging out of the system back at that time, who knows if I was going to even have health insurance to be able to afford all these medications that they were trying to force me to be on. And so it's really important to try to teach youth new ways to cope and get through their trauma, like natural ways, and natural coping skills. For me, I was able to find that through running. So I used to do 5Ks. Around my first 5K on my 18th birthday, but that was something that was like really important, was taking care of like my health and well-being to improve my mental health. And so I think looking at mental health differently as well, especially for our youth of color, because we can't have like that dependency on the medications. And also there needs to be more clinicians that have more representation of clinicians that look like the youth that are in the system that they're serving, because it would have been nice to have a Black therapist to work with, and I hear that from a lot of youth too, is like there's a lack of trust with white people, like, no offense, but like with talking to a white person with all of the trauma and the historical factors. And then when you tie in law enforcement and the way that law enforcement handles our youth of color, I literally just watched a video this past week of a youth. There was an incident at the store. I won't go into all the details or whatever and put that out there, but there was an incident where a youth had autism and he was manhandled by law enforcement, and it was some Black youth and they were being discriminated against in the store, and this youth, like, just to see how they were manhandling this 14-year-old young person, and what happened to those kids? They probably ended up in the system, you know what I mean? Like, who knows? But it's situations like that where it's like they could do better. And are you going to treat a youth of color like that? So it's just situations like that that can be prevented, and we got to do better when law enforcement is coming in and like handling our young people.
Yeah, I sit with the weight of what you both stated, especially around the mental health. I think both of you highlighting that in such a way. Part of it is when those who are in the system are going to receive this service of mental health or behavioral health, depends on how you want to call it. It's oftentimes not as a place of trauma, but as a place to provide support to those who are taking care of this youth, to feel better, to feel like there's a chance that this youth could make it. And it's because we can say it, that the language of trauma is behaviors in our trainings. You can say it in our curriculums. We can write it in our journals. We can write it in our dissertations, and we can keep presenting to it at symposiums. But to practice it takes a lot more work. So it's easier just to say, you know what, I'm going to prescribe this kid some Seroquel. And I'm going to say, you know what, this kid is on some new medication. And the reason why he was verbally aggressive is because we just didn't have the right medication.
Mm-hmm.
And when we dig a little deeper, it creates this narrative that there is a problem, not that something happened to you. And I think that's where, if we're going to talk like what's going on with foster care, is like, it's exactly that, and then we're talking about the prison pipeline. It's because nothing was addressed. It was band-aided. It was all that, but there was never any ointment applied. And all we did was, if we're talking cancer, because that's probably the best way to explain it. We didn't send them through chemo. We didn't send them to have the tumor removed. All we did was scheduled an appointment with no true consultation, but just, this is what is going to happen to you. You have no options, but this is it. And then we're surprised when the life of a child is gone because they have now entered into a prison system. We're the only people who call our youth, when they turn 16, young adults. And we'll use it to criminate them. But then if they're doing good and they're 18 or 19 and they've decided to explore the other options that their state's government may allow for them if they age out, oh, you're just a kid, you're just a youth, you don't understand yet. But when you're 15 and 16 making these mistakes, you know better than this. And that's the message. And then we've got 15 different people telling us. One of the biggest things that I think has helped in my navigating what is deemed as high-risk kids in our system of care was just really truly understanding like where they're at. Not just trying to get where they're at, not just trying to see them where they're at, but to be where they're at and to walk alongside them from where they're at. And I think that takes a lot more work, because if they're frustrated, I'm gonna be frustrated with them. I'm not gonna be like, yo, you sucks to be you, this is the way it goes forward. No, like, it's okay to be frustrated that you're removed from your dad. It's okay to be frustrated that you haven't seen your siblings. Like, that is totally okay. This is a normal behavior because of your experience. But instead we say, you know what, this young adult, because I'm gonna call it exactly, this young adult cussed out me. And then you ask the question, and this is where, us as professionals typically aren't good at. We don't ask the question, which is like, you should have cussed that person out. Not asking like, what happened? What happened before you cursed him out? What were you feeling? What were you thinking? What were you experiencing? And then when we ask those questions, we're like, oh, this makes so much sense. But we don't ask them. So we never know. We're just like, this kid's a runaway. I think I spoke during one of our prep calls about like the 3 kids who were running away from their home every Wednesday. And it was consistently their siblings running away every Wednesday. And they're like, oh my gosh, they always abscond from their placement. They run away. Mind you, these kids come back every single Wednesday too. So they're not really running away. And I was like, well, what are they doing? Where are they going? And nobody's asked them. They're just like, what can we do to stop you from running away? And I said, where are you going? Like, what are you experiencing when you run away? And then they say, oh, no, they didn't say anything. I ended up following them, and they're going to go see their mom's gravesite who passed away. Well, these aren't kids who are just trying to run away. These are kids who are grieving. And now we're able to say, you know what, like, let's talk about your mom. Let's talk about those good memories you had with your mom. Why'd you choose Wednesday? Well, every Wednesday, my mom would take us for ice cream. Oh, wow. This makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to go on to that, I feel like when you're a professional working with these young people, you can't personalize when they're gonna get upset and they're gonna cuss you out. You gotta have thick skin. And I feel like sometimes people would just get so offended and they forget that these are just kids when the cops are coming in hot, for a situation, and all they have is, hey, there's a fight happening at a group home, and then they're coming in hot, escalated, instead of like calming, like coming in a calm demeanor, so that doesn't escalate that youth, right? And then if the youth is going to cuss them out because they're triggered, because law enforcement triggers them, and then they get upset, and then now they're even more escalated, and so I feel like it takes more professional training as well, to where you got to like maintain your composure as the adult, as the professional, to not be trying to like match that same level of escalation as that client. And it takes time, because I feel like that's something that I had to be trained on as well when I was coming in to like work specifically with the transition age youth population as well. So it's just like, it's how you view them and how you look at them, and then just not taking things personal, because it's not about you. So you cannot make this about you when you're working in these facilities, when you're working in these group homes. They're going to be upset. They're going to have a bad day. They're going to wake up in the morning and you're telling them to get out of bed because they got to get their day started. And you might get called out of your name. Oh, well, get over it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. That's just how I feel sometimes, because I feel like some people will just come into this field and just get so offended, and they're like, oh, well, I'm going to kick them out and put them back out on the streets, and just like that spiral, instead of like approaching them in a more trauma-informed care way, allowing them to calm down, and then coming back and having a conversation with them and letting them know why that wasn't okay. You know what I mean? And just kind of just not, like I said, just don't take it personal. You gotta let some of this stuff roll off, for sure.
And just, to go off that, what Tamisha, what you were saying with that trauma-informed care perspective, there is no doubt that any of us that have been through the system, there was a traumatic event of being separated from our families that occurred. And, neurologically, the more trauma that you endure, the more your brain is changed for however long that is. And I think, going back to what Victor was saying, whether you're a kid or you're a teenager, there's some trauma that you have encountered that the system does not, necessarily provide the time for your brain to relearn how to engage with that stimuli, or how the stimuli that, triggers you or brings you to feel scared or unsafe. The system doesn't allow the time for you to adapt. You have to be adaptable, but and we are adaptable as humans, but there's not always the opportunity to become adaptable and to let our brains just mold and change. So I feel like that's just something that's important as we move forward, and hopefully begin to I don't want to say abolish, but as we begin to reduce and become more aware of this foster care to prison pipeline, and what we can do about it is really looking in saying, how do we allow time for our brains and the brains of young people who are in the system experiencing trauma to heal and react differently to stimuli that may be traumatic.
I feel like in our other panels, we've talked a lot about some overarching topics and themes that impact youth and care. And today, hopefully, we're going to get very specific about things child welfare professionals can do who are directly working with youth and care. So I want to start off the conversation around communication. Right, I think if you've heard me speak before, you've definitely heard me say how we speak to and about young people in care is really important. So I want to ask our panelists today, in regards to communication with child welfare professionals, what was most helpful for you as a young person, and what do you try to implement yourself when communicating with other young people in care?
Something that I found very helpful when I was in care was when the people in my life, my CASA workers, my social workers, would speak to me they'd speak to me very candidly. They would be very frank with me, and they'd speak to me in a way that I could understand. And that's something that I've tried to implement in my work now, because oftentimes especially with attorneys who work with youth that they represent, sometimes most of the time, attorneys will end up speaking to youth in legal terms. They'll use GAL, they'll say, attorney, I represent you this way and that way. But they don't take the time to explain what these specific legal terms are, which leaves youth very confused. And being a college grad or being a law school graduate now and hoping to go into a juvenile defense and having represented foster youth in care, that's something that I definitely try to implement when I do work with youth in care, just being able to explain things to them in a way that's age appropriate, in a way that they can understand, and taking the time to say, to explain what's happening in a courtroom, what their choices could be. And I think that's something a lot of child welfare professionals could do to implement effective communication when they speak to other youth in care.
The biggest issue that I specifically faced as a lived experience person is when being in the court system, they didn't explain a lot of things to me. A lot of court procedures were done without my knowledge. They'll say I was deprived. They would come out of the courtroom, explain to me that I was going back into the system. The biggest thing about communication is breaking down to a youth what is specifically happening. What does this mean? What are the next steps? So that youth can understand that, okay, this is why this happened, instead of leaving this gray area of why is this happening to me, not feeling safe, not feeling heard. Just basically being able to, even if a person doesn't think a child will understand, at least the child, especially speaking on my experience, if I would have had that memory, somebody breaking something down to me, even if it went over my head, it would be helpful to at least know that, you know what, they tried to tell me and I remember I didn't understand. And even with that being said, realize that you don't know what these legal terms are or what these policies are, and help them understand and guide them and walk them through it.
I definitely want to second that, especially towards the second part of this question where it said, what do you try to implement yourself when communicating with other young people in care? Just in my experience, not necessarily of youth in care, but youth who are very close, on the precipice of being involved in the child welfare system. I worked at a family homeless shelter for about 3 years in the youth program. And these are youth who have been through some of the same things I've been through in 17 years of foster care, just experiencing homelessness with their families. So just in that instance, like I would try to just, like you said, give it to them straight and give them the benefit of the doubt around what you think they can understand. Because I think what happens with youth a lot is that they don't always know, because they don't always have examples of what it looks like to communicate clearly, quote unquote, maturely, or whatever that looks like. So we don't think they have it in them sometimes. But as youth myself, back in the day when I cognitively understood things that I didn't know how to communicate about, I would be able to understand that if it was communicated to me, but I just wasn't given that benefit of the doubt. So I try to treat these youth like, not like adults, but as youth who have been through things and have the capacity to understand those things, or and whatnot. So yeah, definitely giving it to them straight, being as candid as possible, and then explaining why a certain thing did or didn't happen, you know, explaining who failed, explain, like hold the people in the child's life accountable, like explain, like, you know, and I think that will help not only the youth, but help them build relationships that are gonna make it meaningful for the youth to feel safe and secure, and at least have some support in their life, like they say, like one adult makes a difference. So as far as like what was helpful for me as a young person, exactly that, like being given that benefit of the doubt and being talked to like I could understand complex issues, because I was going through complex issues my whole childhood. So that was, I think what was most helpful would have been that, and was that when I got it. But I often got a lot more examples of like what wasn't helpful. So I don't really know, honestly, how to name what was most helpful, because I don't remember enough being helpful. So that's like what we're wanting to change here.
Yes, thank you for your answers. I think that statement in and of itself, Brittany, was powerful, right? There wasn't enough helpful for you to even bring that into like the conversation. So there's definitely some gaps there. Yeah, I think that clear, consistent communication is huge, which all three of you touched on. And Shamia saying, you know, guiding you through the system, and explaining like who's who too as well, not just what's happening. But I think that is something that many young people face, is the encounter with a whole slew of people, but no one really is explaining like the difference between a CASA and a social worker, or what is a GAL versus a youth attorney, right? Everyone has their own roles and they know that, but the youth, I think a lot of times, and in my personal experience, everyone was a social worker, right? That's just kind of like everyone is a social worker. It's not always the case. So, you know, education is power, and we need to give that back to our young people. And speaking of lots of people coming in and out of youth lives, if there's one thing we could probably all agree on, is entering into the foster care system as a kid, as a youth, is traumatic, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of unknown. So that leads us into our second question: is, given the turbulence of entering and being in foster care, how does this impact a young person's sense of safety and trust? And then part two is, what can child welfare professionals do to support youth in being and feeling safe?
I would just jump in and say that there is a lot of changes around the foster care system, and being in it, like it says, like there's a lot of turbulence. So around that, like how that impacted my sense of safety and trust, like largely just like one example, like as I've been getting older and reflecting on my time in care, it's like mind-boggling how I wasn't even allowed access to the fridge or to the cupboards. Like I'd have lived somewhere for like a while, and then still wouldn't even know where like they keep like plates, you know, just because I wouldn't be allowed access to like things. And that, you know, I couldn't help but understand, especially because it was never explained clearly why. I couldn't help but like boil it down to like, okay, they don't trust me. And so in turn, of course, I don't trust them. And so like that, just like the stipulations of different homes, like just, and how each one is so different. So say like a lot of Black and brown youth that tend to stay in the systems longer, like, you know, for me being in 17 years, like years and years of just not being trusted, like how does that show up later in my relationships with other people? Like, yay, I just get to find that out on my own. Like, you know, it's not fun. And I feel for a lot of my peers and fellow advocates who can relate. And then as far as like safety, I think because of the types of relationships that are formed or aren't formed in homes, it is hard to feel safe, especially when on the basis of the relationship, you don't feel trusted and you don't trust in turn, because it doesn't feel like they're prioritizing you as like keeping you safe, you know? And it feels like safety is something that you should just know, like it's your fault. Like, you know what I mean? Like if you do something unsafe in the home by accident, you know, the response is often like, in my experience, like, yeah, you're yelled at, you're in trouble. Like if I drop a bowl on accident and break it because I'm clumsy, like I'm not being wrapped around in like, hey, like, don't go near those shards because I don't want you to get cut. It's more like, what's wrong with you and why did you do that? And so it's just like all around the lack of like effort in a lot of homes, whether that's adoptive or fostering, because sometimes there's this complex of like, okay, I have you in my home, I'm feeding you, you have a bed, that's all I need to do. There's this complex of like that's enough.
I would have to say in my experience, I was in foster care towards like teenage years all the way until I was, it's not emancipated, but until I aged out. And I was also dually system involved. I was also a juvenile justice youth. And later down the line, I was also a foster youth and a teen parent. So a lot of safety and trust was broken. Make a long story short, I actually was separated from my son during his younger years. And that did a lot. Before that even happened, I had a lot of safety and trust issues being in foster care or in the system, because people would tell you one thing and do another. And it goes back to what we were talking about with communication. Explain to me and tell me what's going on and why this is going on. I didn't have a path to follow. It was one day, oh, you can't be in this home anymore. I didn't know that it was temporary and you couldn't find me shelter. So I'm in this house with these younger children. And then 5 days later, you're moving me to a group home because that wasn't an appropriate place. Nobody said that. I thought I did something wrong. It was always something, this is my fault. I did something, maybe kind of like Brittany said, maybe I broke the bowl. Maybe that's why they got rid of me. When in essence, I wasn't supposed to be there anyway, but no one told me. So how would I know? So you move through these systems always thinking that's I would like to say that youth probably feel like it's their fault. And a lot of the times it's not their fault. If your parents had an issue and you were taken from the home, it's not the youth's fault. Communicate that with them. Let them know, hey, this is what's going on. This is why this is happening. And if the youth like me was acting out, understand that this is still a child, just like it would be any other normal child in a home that would act out, that might get involved with a gang, that might get involved with, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but we know children will be children, especially in their teen years. So when you're a foster youth or system involved youth, you're looked at different, like, oh, you're just out of control. I didn't ask to come here and be in this system.
I think what a lot of child welfare professionals neglect to remember when they speak to foster youth is that we are all traumatized. We were all taken from our homes in some way, shape, or form and put into another home. And we all react to that in different ways. We all experience trauma in different ways, and we all react to it very differently. Some of us will act out, some of us will not speak at all. And a lot of child welfare professionals may see the way we act and reduce us down to a file number, a youth number, something that they have to check. They ask a couple questions and then they check that off their list, and then they're done with us until the next month that they have to speak to us. And I think that's very harmful because it does affect the way that that we perceive safety and trust within the child welfare system. I think it's important for child welfare professionals who will be in the lives of these youth to take the time to build that relationship
in addition to therapy, what else has played a role in your healing and well-being journey?
But I think for me personally, mindfulness and a lot of self-care, just having a positive attitude, also approaching different roles and perspectives due to my life has definitely played an additional role in addition to going to therapy. And for me personally, like my job status now is an actual therapist. So, you know, being and doing psychotherapy is definitely beneficial, but there are some other interventions and tools that you can use, in which I also prescribe to my clients that I see. And one of the reasons I'm a therapist now is because I had a poor experience in the system with actual psychotherapy. So for me now to give back and be in this position and to help and to, I guess, display and encourage others to have different interventions that they do beyond just talk therapy is a gratifying experience. So the mindfulness, the self-care, the positive attitudes, the journaling, the yoga, different meditation and stuff like that, opposed to just talk therapy. Because again, like when I was in the system, it felt like a check in the box, something that the, you know, group home or foster care had to do, being that I was a ward of the state, opposed to a cohesive experience of me actually benefiting from this tool. So I just approach it differently now that I'm in, you know, this current role and position as a therapist and a healer, opposed to how I was many years ago within the system.
I really love that. And I think for me, it was very much like, it's been various different things depending on the seasons of life that I've been a part of. So originally, I think I was very much deeply seated into survival mode. And so I needed more so people around me that could speak life into me. So fortunately, throughout those very dark times in care and even before care leading up to that, just the random people that I would meet just walking in life, like a grocery store clerk, you know, a compliment, that went a long way in the spaces where I felt so alone and so confused and just like, I'm not sure if I have any control over my life. And it very, very much just felt like I didn't. I was trapped. And I think being able to see people that had experiences in poverty, experiences with the child welfare system, that were doing things that I didn't really see could be possible because of my past experience, that was extremely healing for me, being in survival mode and being able to see like, this isn't forever. Like I can do something with my life. And then eventually being able to start to express myself after feeling so suppressed and like, I have to be a certain way. I have to, you know, mold and conform in order to, you know, be the best and best in the way of accepted in the foster home, in social workers. You know, I have to be a certain way. I have to perform a certain way. And it didn't really feel genuine or unique. So to myself, or honest, honestly, a lot of times it just was like, I know these are different things I have to do in order to survive. So I would say in that sense, in survival mode, all those different aspects, and then more so moving into how do I express myself? Who am I? How do I want to be who I am? Whoever that is, you know, that there's so many layers into unfolding that identity piece in healing. And really to what James was saying, looking at the holistic aspect. So not just the talking, but being introduced to spiritual practices like meditating and really seeing that from not the ethnocentric way that it's poised to us, like this is a specific way that this is for, versus the cultural and going back to the roots of the lens to look that through, if that makes sense. So instead of looking at it in the way of like, this is just something to quiet your mind, really looking at it from the, in my culture, looking at that from the Indigenous and African perspective of like, where did that really come from? Like, how did we view that as a people? And so that also goes into the healing of identity and who you are as an individual in this space, whether that is someone that had poverty experience, foster care experience, but really looking at all those different layers. And it is tedious, but making space for that.
For me personally, I believe that, therapy is definitely pushed on us in foster care, and as if like that's the band-aid to it, as in like this is how you're going to get better, especially experiencing the trauma that we went through. And for me personally, like the PTSD and just going through foster home to foster home, where I never saw anybody like me, and I never had anybody that went through the same experiences. And so as a reconnecting Indigenous person, meditation definitely was a way to reconnect back to myself and my body, just to remind myself, that I can have control over that. And it's also mindfulness. It's learning, how we're able to, recenter ourselves in community again. Like I know as many foster youth, a lot of us didn't have community going through the foster care system because you're being jumped from one home to another home to another home. And I would say coming out of the foster care system, one thing that helped me was building my own community, because again, therapy isn't for everybody. And a lot of people just having talk therapy, especially with therapists that might not be the same color as you or have the same experiences, can be really hard and difficult for youth. And again, for me, it was also reconnecting back to my Indigenous culture, my language, and my tradition, even though that was also scarring because I had to reconnect back to it. And that loss of that culture and identity played a huge impact. But once I was able to, get just some part of it, it really blossomed and helped me grow into the person that I am today.
Is how do we move from or transition from surviving into healing?
Yeah, so I would say how we can transition from survival into healing is being honest about what healing means. Healing is not just like this, let's sing a song and things are great. Healing takes time, and it's patience, and it's addressing, being honest about it and being real. It's the idea that this is a long-term journey. Going through the foster care system, experiencing PTSD is not something that you can get over within 5 years. This is through your whole life, basically, for foster youth. We're going to be healing and working through these issues, generational issues as well, through the rest of our lives. And I would say for me, it was, being honest about my PTSD and being honest about what it meant to take care of myself and how to break out of the generational habits and the generational trauma. So I would say basically just being really honest and saying that it's not always therapy, it's not always just meditating, it's maybe sitting there and letting yourself cry and letting yourself really feel those emotions, and being real and honest with yourself and being honest with everybody about what it means for mental health support.
What I would add on that is just that one, and on an individual level, it's absolutely a choice. I think that in working with youth, a lot of times we can get stuck in like, but this happened and it's their fault, and it's everyone else's fault, which may or may not be true, but also like it's our responsibility, it's our life. And at some point you become an adult, right? And you have to create a life that you enjoy, that you feel free to be yourself, to express yourself, to give back into the community. And so I think the biggest how is making the choice, but also to Alejandro's point, like acknowledging where you are, as well as acknowledging the systemic influences on how you feel and what you've experienced.
So I would say also that a lot of people aren't living because they're always surviving. So whether that is a youth or a trans person or an indigenous person or a black man, like it's always survival mode. It's always hypervigilant. It's always the stress of the world, carrying different weight. So I would definitely say to move towards that healing place, you have to identify and recognize that it's not a linear process, so it's going to be some turbulence on the way. It's also going to be what the heck is going on, because realistically healing is not a set destination. It should be something that you constantly practice, like you're never, I don't foresee you ever arriving at healing, you know what I'm saying? Like, and even if you do, you want to continuously to get better and evolve within self. So me personally, I would just say continue to identify what that looks like for you, and just be open to those changes, because adversity is going to happen. It's going to be times where you have to be resilient, and it's going to be times to where you have to take flight, so you have to figure that out. But neither is going to determine your strength or your weakness. It's just going to determine you being able to evolve from where you started from, so again, like many of us who are viewing this were in the system at one point or currently in the system now. So don't look at it as if like once I'm out of the system, I'll be healed, or once I'm away from this specific group of people, I'm going to be healed, or once this happened, I'm going to be healed. View it as I still got work to do. I still have to heal beyond where I am now or where I plan to get to, so it looks different for everybody. It's no set destination.
In your words, what are some practical steps to decolonizing our approach to well-being?
I would say introducing cultural connections is definitely a way to do that. It's like how Veronica was saying, the Western world is just checking off boxes. And, we really forget the reason behind that. Like, why are we doing this? And for Indigenous people, it's our perspective on it is not only like why it happened, but like what we were deprived of as well. And I would definitely say that is another step to decolonizing, is really looking at that and looking at like the Western way and versus like the Indigenous way, which is like, really reconnecting back to the roots, back to the motherland, back to like our culture and our resources.
No,
Oh, go ahead, James. Okay. I was just gonna say, fund our Black, Indigenous, and people of color healers and holistic practitioners. Like at the end of the day, we can't really make any type of traction if there's not a set pot of money for safety of youth, which by the way, the numbers and statistics are not saying that external safety as a focus is really supporting our youth and families. So something to look at is what is actually working and what has worked before the intervention of systems in order to integrate that and really make that the core principles and practices within our welfare system. Because the way that it's going now, to be blunt, is shitty. It's not really working out. And, for everyone else, it's just, it sounds like it's being progressive politically, but it's not progressive on the ground and with families and with youth, because the statistics should not be 70% children to, oh my goodness, child welfare system to prison pipeline, 70% of youth. I'm just like floored by that in 2022. And the same thing for young girls and sex trafficking. How are we at 70%? Like, how is safety a number one concern? And the numbers are that does not add up at all. So obviously you're not doing the right things. Like, that's just the truth. It's great that you got the little statistics and the things that looks really great with the graphs and everything. But it's not really progressive. It's not actually moving forward. So what are the things that we actually need to fund and put that pocket of money towards on the holistic end, and really look at those policies and procedures, because at this particular time, it's not working.
yeah, I would agree. I think we also have to identify what the overall route is, like, who is in charge of certain budgets, of certain decisions and all those things. Because when I think decolonization. I'm thinking more of a new independence, like this is me type thing. So, and I could probably can liken this back to the question earlier about the lack of representation as well, because if it was more voices of people within those circumstances, I think that the funds would be divvied up differently. So if you take an institution like the NFL, right? Like the owner of the NFL didn't even play in the NFL. You know what I'm saying? So he's making decisions based on these athletes, and he don't know what it's like to go to practice or get injured on Sunday and not be away from your family traveling. Well, he probably can identify that because he traveled to games, but like the severityness of it, the lifelong injuries that they're going to sustain beyond the game, like he's not going to experience that. So the same thing within this, I think the people who are making these decisions for the institutions or the foster care system or the group home systems or Department of Social Services or child welfare, like a percentage of them people weren't in the system. So all they know is, or all they're thinking is, I can do this for this child. I can do this for this, adolescent, not knowing that this child, this adolescent, this person has been traumatized, has been victimized, has been uprooted from a life that they once knew, or, is now you got this black boy now with an all white family, or this indigenous girl with the all, Hispanic family, or, this young lady now living with all males or whatever the case is. Like, so now it's adjustment disorders. It's so many different things coming, but I guess the people making decisions thinking they're making the correct decision, or they're ignoring it totally. So I think again, like once it's more inclusion from people like us who's been in those spaces, who's been neglected or didn't have certain resources or didn't have access to certain things, can say, hey, no, I don't think that's a good decision. You know what I'm saying? Like if you look now too, like look how many commercials you've seen, like who approved this commercial? Like that doesn't even make sense. You got men talking about women, or you got um people talking about XYZ. Like, what? Was it any black people in the room when they put this out? Like, how did they not know that this was going to offend somebody? So I think this is the same way. Like, it's so many different examples of, like, yo, get somebody at the table who's experienced this or who can tell you, like, this doesn't make sense. Until then, I think it's going to still be that it's going to be colonized because it's going to be washed down. It's not going to be the actual version of what it is, because realistically, if my perception of what their reality is, it's going to be, oh, well, we got you with this nice family. Okay. To you, it's a nice family, but to me, I'm out of place. Nobody looks like me. Nobody talks like me. Nobody has been through what I've been through. Like, how can I connect with this nice family if I'm not a part of, or if I don't feel like the family, So I think they view it as, we took you out your situation and put you in another situation that's better for you. But that's all suggestive as well. You know what I'm saying? So I think it can be decolonized once we evolve to, let's bring everybody in. What is your take? What do you think we should do here? What do you think these fundings should go? Opposed to, I got this job because I went to school, and but you have no other relative experience to being in this actual system, or going to group home, foster care, or what's it like to be ripped from, like, think about it. Like, I'm a therapist now. I work with social workers all the time. My first encounter with a social worker was being pulled from school saying I'm going to foster care. Like, that could have tainted my whole reality of what social workers are. Like, oh no, y'all separate families. You know what I'm saying? Like, think about how many people now, even as little kids, view police officers bad because that first encounter with the police officer was a reprimand opposed to a community servant. You know what I'm saying? So again, I think it has to be more of people at the table who were in those systems.
Why is it important for advocacy spaces to support young people's social capital and aftercare? And also, what would you say is aftercare?
So it's important to support young people's social capital, meaning the relationships that they have within the system. And also if they're looking to try and share their story and their experiences, because I mean, that's just the right thing to do. Always feeling like my story, my voice, my opinions didn't matter. So holding space to connect with youth on that level is incredibly healing for youth and for folks with lived experience. But it's not just, you know, how can we engage this youth's perspective, story, opinion, and then we give them a $25 gift card. It's really, you know, looking at the importance of why this human being, not just their story, is so valuable to the shift in the narrative, whether that is in your organization, systemically, interpersonally, or just in general as the youth, as the youth's own experience and journey and vision. So for their own life, I didn't feel supported in those spaces. And although I had the support a lot of times from the folks with lived experience as well, I didn't feel as supported by those organizations and those spaces that were supposed to uplift what I was sharing. So what it was about, you know, what do I have to offer? I felt it was very transactional with the organization versus me believing that they actually cared about me as a human, as a person, as a young person. And aftercare is really like, what are you doing after the fact that this young person has shared their perspective, their story, their experience? We reopen those wounds, you know, and I mean, is there any after support with therapy or a healing space to debrief about it, and not just debrief, following up the week after, you know, and saying, hey, are you okay? And you can't bring a youth into a space and talk about homelessness and they're currently experiencing homelessness and expect them to be like fine after you give them a, you know, $10, $25, even $50 gift card. Like that's not sustainable for their whole well-being. So I think on that end as a youth, and for those that are older and have been doing the work for a while, like really looking at the professional expertise and skills and experience, and really making sure that if you're bringing folks that have lived experience and fostering that community piece, that they are also paid well for that expertise, for that consulting a lot of times. And what does that really look like in your own policy and procedures in your organization? Is that really something that you value and putting dollars behind? Or is it something that, I mean, it just ends up being a form of tokenizing otherwise. So just really engaging with folks with lived experience that have also expertise in speaking in, you know, because after a while that you're doing advocacy, it does become a skill. So, I mean, that's something that is definitely a professional fee behind it.
And I think that's a part of healing, to bring multiple of us, you know, into one space, which often organizations can and do. I think is you have a responsibility. You have to, you know, not only like assume the responsibilities and lead with good intentions, but ask the people who you're inviting into the space what they need to be comfortable in the space. I think it's kind of like the hype and like DEI coming up around the world now, like with organizations, like we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, feels like more than ever on a large scale and at the corporate scale, in the nonprofit scale. But we still have to think about like what integration really meant, and like rooting that back into like foster youth. When you're inviting them into these organizations, this is already likely a person who is intersectionally a part of special populations. So they need special attention, special care. And especially because predominantly these spaces are not always reflecting the youth they're inviting in. Yeah, just to highlight all the more, like there's responsibilities that organizations and advocacy spaces have to do this. And I don't think it should be done just out of obligation either. If they truly value us and our stories, then it should just be a given. It should just be something they want to do.
So when we join these advocacy groups and we join these different organizations, we're doing this because we want to help the system, but then we also want to feel that, like, you know, our voice mattered. We want to feel like we matter. We don't want to just feel you're taking people who already had a traumatic experience, who have already been used by the system for their politics and political gain. So it's important to make sure that when someone decides, like, hey, you know what, I'm going to go around telling a bunch of strangers my innermost trauma, my innermost secrets, my innermost pain, I don't think that it's crazy to expect that you get treated with respect for that. Expect that you understand that it takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of humility, and a lot of just willing to be like, you know what, this sucks, but I want to help people. So making sure that there's an atmosphere for them to feel like, you know what, I'm not going to use you like the system used you. I'm not going to use you like everyone else has used you. And I'm going to make sure that you know that your voice not only matters, but it is taken seriously.
I don't know if people recognize, but a lot of times as advocates, I feel like it's almost like a race, right? It feels almost like a race of who can go from, you know, the bottom to the top as quickly as possible, and who's getting the invites to be on panels and webinars and speeches, and who's getting in the room, and you're competing with yourself and everyone around you, and it's stressful. It's so stressful. And I think that builds a culture of where you can't say no, right? Because there's a fear associated with saying no in advocacy world of, well, if I say no once, I'm never going to be invited back again, and my ranking is going to drop, right? Like this competitive nature. And I think that builds a lot of pressure up for many advocates, so much so that we have had to build this image of being put together at all times, and bringing in the mental health thing of not being able to just be in that, you know, we have to just keep pushing through because we can't say no. So there is often that disconnect between the image of advocacy all put together and the reality of that experience. So that's what I was hoping to talk about next, was how has the image of advocacy affected your reality or your life?
And the image of advocacy that was painted to me is that we're supposed to all be like doing political science, and we're all supposed to be wanting to run for president one day, or mayor, or some type of political office. And also we're supposed to, and this is personally speaking, I think that the image of advocacy is they expect us to look a certain way. And so that has negatively impacted me, because I've, like, the way my body type is, I've had instances where I've been trying to do advocacy work, but instead of discussing any type of political things or any type of policies, the conversation has been about, oh, what are you going to wear? How are you going to cover this up? How are we going to, you know, like, how's your body going to look? So it's been so focused on my outward appearance that it's like none of the advocacy that I do matters, because I don't fit the look of what an advocate is supposed to look like. And that's led to me I'm pretty sure I have an eating disorder by now. Like, it's led to me being like fixated on making sure that my body looks a certain way, or if, for instance, like, if I look a little too thick in something or a little too skinny in something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta do better. I gotta fix this, because I don't look right. And so it takes away the joy of being able to change the system, because I'm more focused on trying to make sure that I fit the bill of what an advocate is supposed to look like.
Wow, that was very powerful. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. Wow. The image of child welfare as an advocate, and having everything together and supposed to have made it, be fully healed, doing all the things, have figured everything out. It's so toxic, because it's not like a real human image, right? Like, that's in general. So why is that a standard and expectation? Why is that so high for people to have lived experience in foster care? And the thing is, as advocates, we conform to that because we have to. And it goes back into a certain sense of survival mode. And like, this is how I have to perform and be and show up in order to get the kudos, get that invite, get that connection even, right? Like, it's so damaging to your mental health that I know for me, like, I definitely have considered like continuously like deleting all my social media, stepping away from everything child welfare, because there's that inner competition between folks, because that's also the culture and what organizations are fostering when you're only uplifting one particular experience and not taking into account what that means for the other folks that maybe applied for that position or applied for a space to be able to share their experience. That's the internalized and reaffirmed thought process that, like, my story isn't valuable, I'm not valuable. It goes right back to I'm not valuable. There's another rejection, another organization, agency, person that doesn't care about me. They only care about, and I think I felt like this recently. It was in 2020, actually, after I released my book, and people started talking to me as if like I was a commodity. Started saying things like, yeah, we'll just have you up here, you know, it's going to be great for our marketing. We're going to, you know, get your name and let's talk about your title. What kind of title? Oh, this one's more marketable. And I just, like, I remember I had like 2 days before that event, which I ended up not going because I was like, I don't feel like this is what I'm trying to do. And they were paying well, but it wasn't about that. It was about the culture and the way that they were just kind of like puppeteering almost. But I felt very like drained, and I felt like, man, this is really the last straw. Like, this is like too much of erasing my humanness because I'm fitting a specific thing that at that time became popular because of the Black Lives Matter protests and all the things that were happening. And so spiritually, I was aligned in that way that my book was coming out. But on their end, on the organization's end, it was like a marketing ploy and like, this is great. Yeah, your book, let's support it. And that was extremely exhausting for me. And to think about, as I shared with you all, but like just all the suicide that has happened in our community for that pressure of trying to show up and, you know, trying to make a difference. And also on the back end, because you're so performative in your professionalism, you're not being authentic and honest and real with the relationships that you do have. And where is the space to be authentic and real? You know, with folks that think that they see you and they're like, oh, you have it all together. But where is that space that you can be human? You're like, you can take that off. Because I've noticed in the world in general, like sometimes you do have to be performative, but where are the spaces where you can take it off? Where are the spaces where you can communicate and have those conversations with other advocates and other people that have lived experience? Honest, raw conversations about how you genuinely feel. You know, if you're feeling shitty, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling like, hey, I don't know if I really want to show up to this event right now because I have this and this going on with my birth family, with, you know, those are real life situations, especially with people with lived experience. Your birth family coming to the picture, you found a new sibling. I mean, there's the crazy things that happen. Or just, you know, something came up that day mentally and you're struggling to get out of bed at that time. Where's the space for that? There is no space for that, because if you don't show up, then now you're unreliable and you're not you're not supposed to, you know, have those types of things because you've already made it. You have it all together. You're not supposed to have bad days. What are you doing? You're an advocate. You're supposed to be showing up for everybody else.
I think it's interesting because I'm noticing a theme that we'll talk about in the next question more, but just like of ageism and classism, and a lot of isms and phobias tend to creep in basically just because that's how we're conditioned. But I understand it is necessary in some spaces to get the point across, but I feel like there are ways we're still being silenced There are ways this image of advocacy versus like the reality of it is like affecting how much we're actually getting done. I think professionalism honestly sometimes can just be an excuse to stray away from authenticity, to not have to do those check-ins, to not have to worry about aftercare, because it's a workspace. This is a business space. You guys are on the clock. You guys are getting paid. Like, you know, I've heard all of that in these spaces. Like, but then the next second, like you're asking me to share about my experience being Black in foster care, like as if that's not very emotional, real, raw, like you said, like these are raw conversations, raw things we're sharing, like, yeah, not to be commodified. And I think talking about ageism too, and like how that ties in, I think if we reevaluate what professionalism really means and what it should and could mean, then we can begin to create actual healing spaces where community and healing and real change is prioritized. Tangible, long-lasting change. You know what I mean? So we're talking about like how we're like more vulnerable when we're more valuable when we're younger. That's what it feels like. We're more valuable when we're younger, like when we're fresh out, but that's when we're most unhealed.
What is your hope for the healing and well-being of youth currently experiencing care or those who may enter in the future?
So my hope is definitely around community-centered, freedom-focused, and healing as opposed to coping. But for the embedded holistic health and wellness practice for each constituent, really taking care on the back end and on the front end of the human needs of those foster parents, social workers, youth, families, and really being able to center that as opposed to like it being very transactional.
I would like for us to imagine and think of ways, how can we help these families overcome substance abuse, seek the right mental health help.
It's just focusing back on community, learning to communicate, and making easy access to plethora of types of education that would help avoid some of the issues that lead to the trauma and generational cycles that a lot of us have and why we were in care.
My hope for the future for the system is that we're no longer needed. I mean, I think it's crazy that it's been decades and we're still having the same conversations. And everyone wants to sit around the table and talk about, oh, that's crazy, we need to do this, but yet no one's doing anything. So my hope is that we stop talking, is that as organizations stop talking and start walking.
This system actually structured to where this could help people go further, because as we know, things do happen. Someone might be a quote unquote orphan and have to go into the system, but should they come out more traumatic than they went in? No. So I would like for the system to just be built by basically foster youth, the system involve youth.
Yeah, I want our youth to know that they matter, that their voice matters, their stories matter, and that they are someone, and that they can be whatever they want to be. They can achieve success. And I want professionals working with young people, I want them to know that our youth really just need someone to be there, to listen, to not give up on them, to not label them, to not criminalize them.
It would be youth having mentorship roles and just having a village of just community and support that all youth deserve and need. It's having the foundation of knowledge, language, and religion or culture. And it's being able to share without having fear of conversations around heritage and identity and relationships.
I just want the system to work as well as it should work, as well as youth deserve. And as for foster youth, my hope for youth within the system, I hope we all find our peace. I hope we're all able to heal from the trauma that is foster care, and that we end up listening to our own voices and being able to achieve our versions of success, whatever it may be.
To all the young people listening out there, you are more than any dollar amount that's put to your name. And you know, you're more than your biggest mistake, whatever that is. And just, I hope everybody listening is aware of this phenomenon now, and you know, works to really abolish it.
My hope and dreams for not necessarily the system, but for the children and the families that are affected by the system on a daily basis. This is more of a word to you. So whoever's watching, if you are struggling, whether that be with your own family, with yourself, CPS, law, anything, if you are struggling, just remember that as an Indigenous person, you are automatically resilient. And we are beautiful people, and we always stand together. So instead of feeling, although you are isolated, you may feel isolated. You do not want to play into it. You want to be resilient and come forth and build communities with one another. There are many people just like you going through similar traumatic events. And it is up to you if you want to decide and stay stuck. You can choose to be stuck, but you have the power to also move. You can move wherever you need to be in order to move up in the future and to provide for your own future.
Do what's best for you and your journey. So, you know, connect with the right people or shy away from those people that you feel, you know, aren't conducive to your growth. You know, it's all important in how you look at it, but definitely ensure that you're going to be vulnerable and open to new experiences, because life is forever changing, it's forever evolving. So just because you're in a system now, that doesn't dictate like how you can turn out, you know.
Even if by chance you do enter the criminal justice system, you can still be a better somebody when you leave. You know, foster care, you know, you can still be a better somebody when you leave. Someone who is powerful, strong, someone who has things to do, places to go, and just yourself to impress.
That would be my hope for the future, is that people finally see us, right? See, and also that we see ourselves, like, look at everything we've endured and we're still here. That's strength and that's power.